Has anyone ever said that you look almost identical to Orlando Bloom?
It's been a while since anyone said that. Yeah, I used to get it a lot more. I don't know if I used to look like him more or it was at the height of his, Lord of the Rings and
and Pirates of the Caribbean. I've just finished all the Pirates of the Caribbean, and then every time, coming up to this podcast, it was like every time I see him, it's just like that's Storm.
This production was recorded at the podcast studios in the Media Arts Centre at Murdoch University. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Murdoch University. Any content provided by the hosts and guests are their personal opinions and are not intended to represent the views or opinions of the university, its administration, faculty, or staff. Now we have that out of the way, let's talk science. Paramount importance.
You could be a pirate.
Well, yeah.
Parasite pirate.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know if that has a nice ring. Parasite.
I mean, it's no worse than parasitologist. So.
Yeah. Well, on that note of parasites,
yes.
What is a parasite and how does that differ from your viruses and your pathogens and the other realm of those kind of critters?
That's a good place to start. All right. So we all have some idea of what a parasite is. So it's a familiar term. So politicians, ex-wives, young children and the like. But even if we constrain ourselves to biology, the answer is not so trivial, and biologists don't always apply the term consistently. So I would say a strict definition of parasitism is where you have one individual of a single species that attaches on or in another individual of a different species and feeds on it for the duration of a stage of its life cycle. So there's a few things to unpack with that definition. The first is parasitism is a type of symbiosis. We have to be careful with the term symbiosis. So it's often used to suggest a relationship between two organisms where they're living and working together cooperatively. But that's what we would usually term mutualism. But the definition of symbiosis doesn't require that the two organisms are working together. And really, philosophically, we might even be able to say that parasitism and mutualism are two ends of a sliding scale, depending on the ability for those two organisms to exploit one another and tolerate one another. So it's a type of symbiosis. What we mean by that is that it's a particularly close relationship, and that relationship is durable. So for a strict definition of parasitism, remember I said that the parasite remains attached for the whole life stage while it's feeding. The other part of the definition is that it's a consumer relationship. So the organism's feeding on the other organism. Some looser definitions of parasitism extends to things like kleptoparasitism. So that's where one species is stealing food from another, but not feeding on that species.
That's like the parasites that eat the fish's tongue and...
Well, no, that's a true parasite. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in that case, these tongue biters are attaching to the organism and they're feeding on the host tissue. They might also, it can get complicated. Depending on the species of parasite, they might also be feeding on the food of that host, but they're attached to the host. Kleptoparasitism would be something more like frigate birds. So frigate birds are seabirds, and they like to steal fish from other seabirds after those birds have already done the hard work and caught the fish. So they're not attached, they're not a parasite, they're not living in symbiosis, they're just coming along and snatching the food from the other bird. Yeah.
So that's called kleptoparasitism.
Yeah, klepto just means stealing.
Right.
Yeah. But they're not, so you can extend the term parasitism, but it's not a type of symbiosis. Another common type of parasitism in the broad sense would be something like a cuckoo. So a nest or a brood parasite. So the cuckoos are stealing parental care from another species. Instead of raising their own chick, they lay the egg in the nest of another bird, and that bird brings that chick food. That's not true parasitism because it's not feeding on the host and it's not living It's living in a type of symbiosis, but not the type of symbiosis where the organism is attached on or in the other organism. And another part of that definition that's important is that I didn't include any requirement for harm or some negative impact to the host. Many definitions of parasitism require or at least imply that there's some harm to the host. So the symbiotic relationship is to the detriment of the host organism. But we don't strictly need that for the definition to work. And the reason that we don't require it is, first, harm is very often difficult to detect and measure. It can be easy when it's obvious. It's not easy when it's not obvious. And there's certainly many species of parasites that are so small relative to their big vertebrate hosts, for example, that even though they're feeding on the tissues of that host, there's no detectable impact. You can't see any signs of pathology. You can't measure any loss in the fitness or the body condition of the host. But it's still a parasite because it's still feeding on the organism. So we don't require harm necessarily. It's also worth pointing out what we're excluding in that definition. So in addition to politicians and bad neighbors and young children, we can also exclude things like a fetus, which, it's also funny, but it's not so clear because a fetus is feeding directly from the mother and it's attached to it like a parasite, but it's a different species. So we require a interspecific relationship for parasitism. But we're also excluding micropredators. So these are things like leeches, ticks, mosquitoes. So these are organisms that attach temporarily. They feed on the host, usually on blood, but then they detach, they digest the blood meal. And then when they're ready to feed again, they attach again, but usually to a different individual, regardless of whether that's the same host species or a different host species. So that's not that durable, close, symbiotic relationship that we're looking for parasitism, where one organism remains attached for the duration of its life stage.
Right. So ticks are not parasites.
They're not strict parasites. They are often studied by parasitologists historically and in contemporary times, but that's for historical reasons. And like I said, you can stretch that definition of parasitism. Now, all these micropredators, things like ticks, mosquitoes, leeches, they are really important because they feed on blood. And that means they often transmit other parasites, blood parasites. So they're important as vectors for true parasites, but they're usually not parasites in the strict sense.
Right.
But to get to the other part of your question, finally, there's nothing in that definition that excludes single-celled organisms. So far I've been talking about animals, but certainly most of there's many single-celled parasites that we consider true parasites, and the most devastating parasites for humans, at least in terms of deaths, many of those are single-celled organisms, so protists or protozoans. So things like Plasmodium, which causes malaria. This is the worst parasitic disease of humans worldwide in terms of deaths.
They're the ones from mosquitoes.
That's right, yeah. So the mosquito is the vector, the micropredator that transmits the Plasmodium parasite. Plasmodium is a parasite of humans, but also of the mosquito. Actually, there's many different species of Plasmodium. So birds, reptiles, various groups of mammals all get malaria in some form from different species of Plasmodium. So for humans, malaria kills something like, I think it's 600,000 people a year.
Yeah, it's the biggest one.
Yeah, the biggest killer in terms of parasitic disease, unless we include bacteria, which we're about to get to. So Plasmodium's, it's single-celled, but it's not a bacteria. It's still eukaryotic, so it's a protist or a protozoan. That's different to the bacteria.
So I just want a definition of a eukaryote.
So a eukaryote, so we can divide all of life into two broad categories, the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are things like bacteria, so they lack a nucleus in their cell, and a lot of the other specialized organelles that the eukaryotic organisms have. So we're eukaryotes because we have a nucleus. The DNA is packaged in chromosomes within the nucleus of the cell.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, eukaryotes are everything that are not bacteria, but some eukaryotes are still single-celled. They're not all multicellular like us.
Okay.
So there's many, many species of eukaryotic organisms, many different groups. Many of them are free-living. Many of them are parasitic. There's nothing in our definition that excludes bacteria from being parasitic. So just like the single-celled eukaryotes, there's many bacteria that are free-living. They're in the environment everywhere. There's many that live on or in our bodies in mutualistic relationships or commensalistic relationships where they're not causing any harm. But there's also many species, obviously, that cause a terrible disease. And just like other parasites, they require the host body for reproduction and to feed and to grow. So they're a parasite for all purposes of the definition. But mostly I think it's mostly as an artifact of history. Parasitologists don't study bacteria, and bacteria aren't usually, the definition of parasitism isn't usually extended to bacteria. So microbiologists study bacteria. Parasitologists study the other parasites, so the eukaryotic parasites. And even that's not true. Parasitologists really study parasitic animals and the parasitic protists. There's plenty of plants and fungi that are parasitic. Those are studied by botanists historically and maybe more recently.
Oh, it sounds like it's already just a huge field. Like it's everywhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So it'll be hard to be across everything. You'd have to have a niche, which I think your niche is in fish parasites.
Yes, that's right. So really, I'm not really a parasitologist. Primarily, my main focus is taxonomy. So I come to parasites as a taxonomist who happens to work on parasitic animals, but my background isn't in parasitology. Of course, I have to be abreast a lot of parasitology because I work on parasitic organisms, but parasitologists are usually interested in the trouble that parasites cause and how to deal with that. Yeah.
I want to just go back to the start with so how does it differ, bacteria differ, and viruses and pathogens differ from parasites? Because that's
right. So okay. So I would say bacteria can count as parasites. Viruses are a bit special, and they're difficult. So, I mean, there's always this debate about whether viruses count as living organisms. My understanding of the consensus at the moment, or the popular opinion, is we tend to think that viruses are organic, but not organisms. So they're not made of cells, but they are made of protein and DNA, the things that make up organic organisms. And so if we're not even counting them as organisms, that precludes them from being parasitic organisms, obviously. But they are worth considering in the realm of parasitism to an extent. So viruses don't feed. So remember we said that parasitism is a consumer relationship, an organism feeding on another organism. Viruses don't feed. They don't eat like animals, and they don't make their own food like plants. So they don't count as parasites in that way either. But there is one important similarity between true parasites and viruses, and that is that viruses require a host, another organism, for their reproduction, which is true of parasites as well. So in that way, they're similar to true parasites, and they behave in the way that parasites behave. They cause disease, just like bacteria and other parasites.
But they're not a part. So it's like parasitic traits.
Yeah, they have one important parasitic trait. They don't have the other important parasitic trait, which is that they don't feed.
So is it like what you're saying is like the list of criteria to be a parasite?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So we require a symbiotic relationship. It's a feeding type relationship, but there's looser concepts that allow things like the cuckoo, things like viruses, things like bacteria.
Is parasites one of the broadest most diverse range of like organisms?
Yes. So in terms of the number of species, it's almost certainly the case that parasitism is the dominant strategy of life. So most organisms, most life forms are parasitic, at least for some stage of their life cycle. Many parasites have a parasitic stage and then a free-living stage. But most species are parasitic. So it's the majority, not the minority. It's very different to our experience of biology. So most biologists, regardless of their particular field, go through their whole university studies and their whole scientific career without really encountering parasites all that much or thinking about them all that much. So ecologists, for example, dealing with food webs and interactions between species, they're missing out on the majority of species. So biology is the study of life. Most life forms are parasitic. And really, biology is the study of parasitism with some other free-living side notes. But it's the other way around. But that's changing. Parasites are increasingly becoming incorporated into mainstream thinking in topics like evolution and ecology.
What can parasites tell us about the health of an ecosystem? If that's the case, if they're everywhere.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they're not exactly having that mutualistic relationship.
Yep.
Are they healthy for the environment, or what is it saying?
Okay, so we need to separate the impact of parasites on the individual host organism that they're exploiting and then the ecosystem as a whole. So obviously, for the individual, it's no fun to have parasites. Sometimes some parasites you're not even aware of, they don't even cause trouble. But when they do, it can be terrible. They can kill the host, or they can cause severe suffering and morbidity. We know that as humans. We see it in livestock, in our pets. It happens in wild organisms as well. When we think about parasitism at the ecosystem level, like we just said, most species are parasites. So that means that parasites are ubiquitous and abundant. They're in all ecosystems everywhere. Now, a healthy ecosystem is one that supports, or it's characterized by a high richness and a high diversity of parasites. Again, that might sound counterintuitive or paradoxical, but we're talking about the ecosystem level. So if we think about what we mean by ecosystem health, well, there's a few ways we might define it, and a few criteria that we might use to measure ecosystem health. But one of those is usually going to be biodiversity, the number of species that we can support in a system. And really that's a proxy for complexity. So let's imagine that we're managing a game reserve in Africa. The most obvious marker for how well we're doing is going to be the big obvious mammals. We want to see some zebra, some wildebeest, various species of antelope. But those are all the herbivores. They're all at that one trophic level in the ecosystem. It gets very exciting once we get some lions in there. Everyone wants to see some lions. And that's because not all species are equal. As we move up the trophic chain, we're able to support not just an additional species, but a species that requires additional complexity. So the lion is a symbol that our system is sufficiently complex that we can support that next trophic level. If we think about, actually, if we're doing really well, we might also be able to sneak in some leopards, some cheetah, maybe even some painted dogs. So things that the lions would normally exclude because they're competitors. So as we have increasing complexity, we support increasing trophic complexity and then those competitor relationships as well. But we need to remember that parasites really are just a special type of predator. So the zebra are going to have parasites, but the lion are also going to have parasites that sit above the zebra in the trophic relationships. And some of those parasites are going to be moving up the food chain. So many parasites have complex life cycles where they require multiple different species throughout different stages of their life cycle. So you need to have some invertebrates, you need to have something like a zebra, you need to have some lions for those parasites to move up. You need to have all of those pieces in place if you're able to then attract this fantastic parasite to your game reserve that no one's going to come and see.
Yeah.
If we then
no
think
one
about,
can see it, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, we can shoot a lion and cut it open. That sort of thing is frowned upon. So if we think about deteriorating ecosystem health, so when ecosystem starts to decline, really we're starting to see a loss or the breakdown of interactions between species. And you're going to start by losing the species that require the greatest complexity. So you're going to lose the leopard before you lose all the zebra as the system deteriorates. But some of those parasites require even greater complexity than things like a leopard. So let's say you have a species of parasite that's specific for the leopard. Before the leopard is lost from your system, you're going to lose the parasite. Because from the perspective of the parasite, the leopard is an island of habitat. And as there are fewer and fewer leopards, it becomes harder for that parasite to complete its life cycle and transmit from one leopard to another, regardless of whether that's direct transmission or whether it's going through the food chain. So in that sense, the loss of parasites can be an early marker for things to come. You're going to lose the parasite before you lose the hosts.
Why are parasites important though?
Well, they're important in the first place simply because of their dominance in terms of biodiversity. Most species are parasites. We don't want to lose most species, regardless of how we might feel about them. They're also important because they regulate host populations in the same way that predators are important.
Like keystone species.
Yeah, that's right. So certain parasites can have keystone effects. But it's not always obvious because they're hidden. And really this is a relatively new field where we're combining things like ecology and parasitism. So traditionally, ecology was focusing on all these free-living organisms, but the effects of parasites are often going unnoticed behind the scenes. Anything that causes disease is important because disease regulates populations. So parasites can regulate populations just like other diseases. They can regulate populations just like predators. Gone are the days when we think that lions are bad because they're killing all the zebra. We have a lot of respect for predators in their role as top-down control on the host populations and the importance of those dynamics.
Like removing the sick, removing the...
That's right,
like natural selection, essentially.
Yeah. Well, so that, absolutely. And that brings us to the next way that parasites are important. And that's that they can influence, change the outcome or manipulate interactions between other free living species. All right, so if we go back to our lion that's hunting the zebra, and we see those beautiful scenes from some BBC documentary with this majestic lion. Like you said, it's going for the sick and the weak because those are the easiest prey. What if it's the case that the lion only manages to get its food because of the parasites in the zebra making it sick? So there was a very nice illustration of this in the late 80s in the US, not with lions and zebras. They used a red-tailed hawk, and they had a captive hawk, and they would take it out hunting. They did this something like, I think it was something like 450 times, 450 individual hunts. And the hawk would fly off and it would hunt and it would bring back either a chipmunk or a rabbit or a squirrel. And the chipmunk are the easiest to catch. So when a chipmunk sees the hawk, it gets startled for a moment and then just bolts in a straight line. So the hawk can clean it up most of the time. Rabbits are a bit trickier. They're more alert and they run off in a bit of a zigzag and they're more difficult for the hawk to catch. And then the squirrel is most difficult of all. So squirrels are hypervigilant, and as soon as they see the hawk, they bolt up a tree. So the chase becomes three-dimensional. So the hawk brings back more chipmunks and then rabbits and then squirrels. So when this hawk would bring back the prey, the handler would confiscate it, and then they dissect the animal, and they count all the worms in the gut. So all of these different prey types had nematodes, they had trematodes, and they had tapeworms. So they would count all the different individual worms of these different species. Then they went out with a gun, and they would just shoot indiscriminately chipmunks, rabbits, and squirrels as they would come across them. This was back in the 80s. You could do that. So they got a random sample of these prey types, and then dissected them, and they looked at the number of parasites again. And so they compared the randomly sampled parasites to the parasites in the prey that were brought back by the hawk. What they found for the chipmunk was that there was no difference. But then when they looked at the squirrel, they found that there were more worms, so higher prevalence and higher intensity of infection. So all the squirrels were infected, the ones that the hawk brought back, and they had more worms for each of those 3 different groups of worms than the squirrels that were randomly sampled by going out and shooting them. So that's a very nice result and a very nice natural experiment, because what they were able to demonstrate was that the parasites were tipping the balance in a predator-prey interaction in favor of the predator, but only in the case of the squirrel. And the squirrel is the prey that's more difficult to catch. The parasites didn't have any effect on the relationship between the chipmunk and its predator, because chipmunk are easy to catch. For the rabbit, the results were intermediate. So they didn't find that rabbits were infected more frequently, but for one group, the trematodes, they found more than double the number of trematodes. So these rabbits had thousands of worms in them.
Right. So that would also then limit the pressure on, like, say, the chipmunks, because if it's able to hunt other species. Right. Yeah.
Yep. And so it might be the case that the hawk isn't able to eat squirrels unless the parasites are there. So if you lose those, and remember, we're dealing with 3 different groups of parasites here: the tapeworms, trematodes, and the nematodes. So it might be the cumulative burden of all of those parasites, or it might be that one of those parasites is particularly troublesome for the host.
Are they the most common parasites?
Yeah. So if we're just talking about parasitic animals, some of the groups of worms are the single richest lineages. So traditionally, among animals, we think of the parasites as being the worms or the helminths, and then the arthropods. There's many different arthropod groups that have come to parasitism independently. The most important or the richest groups are things like flies, wasps, which are
they parasites?
Well, there's many groups of wasps that are what we call parasitoids. Now, traditionally, parasitologists didn't count parasitoids, things like wasps, and they were studied by entomologists. But they have a parasitic stage in their life cycle. So there's a lot of species of wasps that find something like a caterpillar, lay their eggs inside it. Those eggs hatch into little larvae, and those larvae eat the caterpillar from the inside out as they grow. So that particular life cycle, where the larval stage is a parasite, but the adult is free living, the wasps fly around just like a regular wasp. That's called a parasitoid. It is a type of parasitism. But anyway, and then the other big group, aside from arthropods, are the worms. So, I should say that just in the animal kingdom alone, parasitism has arisen independently at least 220 times. So there's at least 220 different groups of animals that have switched from a free living way of life to a parasitic way of life. There's many groups of
Is that a lot compared to other types of?
Yeah, that's a lot. So, I mean, I'm talking here about things like flies, wasps, and then worms. Those are 3 groups. There's 220 groups. In terms of animal phyla, we typically think of there being something like 33 or 35 phyla.
Right.
Depending on which textbook you're looking at. It changes a bit. Parasites are found in 15 of those phyla. But in some of those phyla, things like the arthropods, they've switched to parasitism multiple times.
Yeah. So it's a very effective life strategy.
Yeah, that's right. It has challenges, but once you overcome those challenges, there's a lot of rewards. So a parasite needs to find its host. It needs to get into its host. It needs to beat the immune system and survive in its host. And then it needs a way for its eggs or whatever to get out. But once you're in there, you're in a pantry. It's a habitat where you're bathed in food. So you have a lot of the time, certainly parasites in big things like us, invertebrates, have an unlimited food supply. It's a hostile environment. You're always under attack by the immune system. But if you can beat it, there's rewards.
If you're a healthier organism, would it be harder for a parasite to infect you?
Yes.
So you'd have a better immune system.
So generally that's right. At the same time, most parasites are specialized for their host, and they do a pretty good job of beating the immune system. And most individuals of most species are carrying parasites most of the time. A lot of the time, those parasites aren't causing any trouble. So their relationship is so close that they manage to beat the immune system, get into the host, persist in the host, not cause too much trouble, get out again without killing the host, but at the same time without being killed by the host. That's not to say that parasites are benign, but certain parasites certainly are. Most people have things like the mites that live in the hair follicles on our face. Most people have them. Something like over 90% of people worldwide have these things. That's right. So you might think of them as commensal, but they're parasites in the sense that they're living on you persistently and they're feeding on you. But you don't notice them unless the balance shifts and you end up with itchy eyes and all sorts of trouble. But that's when that balance shifts and something goes wrong.
Is that when you become a little bit less healthy?
It might be. It might be that their population goes up for some reason. It might be that there's some other third factor that is, I don't know much about the mites specifically, but if maybe some external factor is clogging your follicles or something. Maybe maybe there's an interaction that causes
clogging the follicles, as in more makeup.
Well, possibly. I don't know much about hair mite follicles and what triggers, but I can imagine that there's all sorts of external things that might tip that balance in one way or the other, either in favor of the host that managed to get rid of the mites, or in favor of the mites, and it might cause trouble.
I think you said it earlier, but is there benefits to having different parasites to the host?
To the individual host?
Yeah.
Yes, there can be. And it's important not to get too carried away with this and to remember that really almost by definition, parasites are causing trouble to their host in some way. It's a symbiotic relationship where one organism is exploiting the other. But most of the time, the host is at least tolerating the parasite. And there can be benefits. So, for example, when we think about conservation of things like mammals and birds, what we like to do these days is breed a population and then relocate them to an area where the species used to be present, but now they've gone extinct. Back in the day, they would always treat those animals for parasites, get rid of all their worms, all their mites, ticks, all of that, before they sent them out into the wild. And they would raise them in a captive setting without parasites, so they don't have any exposure to parasitism. There's two potential effects there, which we might be able to consider in terms of benefits to the individual that's parasitized. One is if you have specific parasites, parasites that you've co-evolved with over a long period of time, then the host is in balance with those parasites and is able to tolerate them. And probably the parasite isn't causing too much harm for the host. Exposure to those parasites might prime the immune system to keep the host healthy when it encounters novel parasites. Whereas a naive host individual that hasn't had its immune system primed might be more susceptible to disease from other parasites, potentially. The other benefit is there might be competition between parasites. So if you've got your own specific parasites that you're okay with, you can tolerate them, they might be able to compete and keep out some other parasites that might cause more harm, some novel parasites. So those are potential benefits to the parasite, to the individual host. When you look at the population level, just like disease, weeds out the weak, parasites and predators do the same thing. When you look at the species level in terms of evolution, there's this arms race between parasites and their hosts just like there's arms races between predators and prey. And those arms races, they're necessary, but they're also, if you remove those parasites, you're removing that constant struggle. And then again, you might be exposing that species over time to novel parasites, novel threats, potentially.
Well, that's, super interesting. It's just making me think about like fish restocking, because that's like a very popular thing, but it's also extremely, not all the time that's successful with it, and trying to figure out why, well, not myself, but I know they trying really hard to figure out why the fish, when they restock them, don't survive. And that potentially, because they're always reared in aquaculture facilities, which I would assume not have many of the parasites that are out in the free living ocean or wherever they're releasing them into. And that could potentially be one of the
It could be one of the factors. Like I said, it's important not to get carried away. Certainly there's other factors that are going to be at play there. And the solution isn't as simple as introducing some parasites to a captive setting. So really it's in captive settings where parasites that are normally tolerated at low levels in natural systems can cause trouble, especially for things like fish. So fish are excellent hosts for parasites. Part of that is that there's an awful lot of fishes. So I think something like all vertebrate species of fishes, and they've got this long evolutionary history with many parasitic groups. And a lot of those parasitic groups started off in the oceans. So they've got an even longer history than the land-based tetrapods. But the other part of the reason that fishes are such good hosts is that they're in the aquatic environment. It makes it a lot easier for, well, at least small animals or single-celled things that need moist environments to be able to transmit so they don't dry out. So fishes get an awful lot of parasites. Most species of fishes, if you cut open a standard medium-sized fish, you're going to find multiple different species of parasites in different parts of the fish at the same time. And the fishes are, for the most part, tolerating those parasites just fine. At the individual level, certainly at the population level. If you bring those parasites into an aquaculture setting or some sort of a captive setting where you're massively increasing the density of the fish, potentially increasing the stress on the individual fish because they're crowded. And potentially there's issues with water quality as well. Much finer balance because you've got all these fish in a small body of water. Some of those parasites can very quickly cause serious parasitic disease. The ones that are most prone to doing that are the ones that have direct transmission, where they reproduce and then jump just from one fish to the next. So in natural settings, the environment's much more dilute. They have to find another fish of the same species when they're schooling or whatever. In a captive setting, you're cramming all those fish together, and they can multiply rapidly, and they can go from things that are feeding on the skin, the scales, a little bit of blood or tissue, to devouring the fish, just because there's so many of them. So, yeah, certainly I'm not advocating for just introducing some parasites to see if that improves outcomes. But at the same time, when we're thinking about conservation, parasite conservation is a very new topic. And the idea is we're thinking about the fact that most species are parasitic, so we don't want to lose them because they're most species. But also that each species has its own inherent value, and maybe we should be conserving parasites along with their hosts. We don't want to be spending, it's hard to get the taxpayer behind saving a parasite, and that's understandable and that's reasonable.
It's got a very negative connotation to the word.
Yeah,
parasites.
Absolutely. Politicians and young children. Part of that is, that's a very human-centric viewpoint of projecting human values onto natural systems. As soon as you're dealing with ecology, there's no good or bad. Everything's struggling to survive. But when we're talking about parasite conservation, at the very least, when we're saving a particular species, a big bird or a mammal or something, we might pause before we deworm it and delouse it and send it back out there.
If we lost parasites, what would happen?
Well, we have lost parasites, and we've lost parasites through conservation interventions for their hosts. So things like the Californian condor, it's probably the most famous example. It had past tense, a species of
what's the condor?
Condor is a big raptor, kind of like a vulture, but in the Americas.
Okay.
And so this is a big bird that the American public really got behind. They spent tens of millions of dollars saving this species, and they did it. They brought the condor back from extinction, had breeding programs and all of that, and there's now established wild populations. And as far as I know, they're doing okay. But when they did all of this, when they bred these condors in captivity, relocated them, they made sure that they deloused them. And there was a species of feather louse, so lice, that was specific for the condor and that went extinct in that conservation effort. So they spent tens of millions of dollars. They saved one species, but they directly caused the extinction of another. And we might think about that philosophically in terms of the net benefit there is, one species saved, one lost. Is that worth that effort? We can at least look to see whether those lice are causing trouble for the condor before we eradicate them. And the other way of thinking about it is those tens of millions of dollars could have saved two species for the price of one, whether or not we knew about the parasite. Yeah.
But what happens if, because we lost the parasite, you've lost a species.
Yep.
It's very hard to pictures it's a parasite. What about it? Yep. We saved the bird. The bird's way more.
Yeah, of course. But, no one's advocating for saving the parasite at the expense of the
Does it start shaping the ecosystem though if you start losing parasites?
It does. Maybe if you lose one parasitic mite or louse from a bird like a condor, there's no real impact at the ecosystem level. But certainly when you start losing large numbers of parasites, there can be issues. There can be issues for the ecosystem, but parasites can also serve as a marker for that declining biodiversity. So at the moment, I have a student I'm working with from Sri Lanka, and we've been doing trips to Sri Lanka and we're sampling fish from the fish market. Most of my field work back here in Australia has been sampling in places like the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland or Ningaloo Reef here in Western Australia. And coral reefs around the world, or at least in the Indo-Pacific, are largely connected and we see the same sorts of fishes. And Sri Lanka's right in one of these biodiversity hotspots. And so we were pretty exciting, expecting to see roughly the same sort of biodiversity, the same types of parasites, but maybe different species to what we see here in Australia. And certainly we were getting parasites. So we were getting these fishes from the fish market, and you get all sorts of wonderful fish there, and they'll eat anything, the smallest fish, protected species, big sharks and rays and things. So depressing in that sense, but a smorgasbord in terms of parasites. But overall, we haven't quantified this, and it's a difficult thing to quantify. We felt that we weren't seeing parasites quite as frequently and in quite the number of variety and numbers that we would expect based on our experience here in Australia. It's very difficult to measure that because we don't have a starting point. For parasites in fishes in Sri Lanka, there's no history there in the country of taxonomic surveys of these parasites in fishes. So even if we quantified how many parasites we're seeing, we don't have a baseline to compare against. We are potentially creating a baseline for detecting further deterioration if that's what's going on in the future. And it's also difficult to say why. So a lot of these parasites require complex ecosystems so that they can move up the food chain through multiple host species. So the fish is still there.
Yeah, so if it's overfishing or poor water quality, that would impact.
Yep, and it could be things like the snails are disappearing or other invertebrate groups. So if the habitat where these fishes are being, so the fishes are still there, a lot of them are pretty small. And that could be another factor. So the bigger a fish is, the longer it's had to acquire parasites. It's just been exposed to more parasites over its lifetime. So that's one of the reasons. And like you say, overfishing therefore could mean that a lot of those parasites don't have the opportunity to get into the fish. There's not enough fish that are living long enough to support the parasites. But it could be that the habitat around the fishes is being degraded, that there's a loss of a lot of the invertebrates that are needed for that parasite to move up the food chain before they get into the fish. So if you lose the snails and the crustaceans before you lose the fish, you might lose the parasites as well.
I'm struggling to sort of wrap my head around like in an ecosystem like that, what if you did lose those parasites? Would you lose the ecosystem?
Well, okay. So it's a difficult question. You wouldn't lose the ecosystem, but the ecosystem would change, I would think. So if we're talking about the sudden loss of a large group of parasites, something like trematodes, which are perhaps the richest lineage of parasitic animals.
Oh, that's like the flatworms.
Those are the flatworms, the flukes. So these things are ubiquitous in the ecosystems. They also account for a lot of biomass. So there was one study recently in California in some salt marshes where they've been doing a lot of parasitology work over a long time on these marshes. And they attempted to quantify the biomass of the parasites in addition to all the other animals. And they found that the dominant group of animals in that system were trematodes. And I think they equated it to something like 3 elephants worth of biomass walking around this salt marsh. That's a massive loss of biomass. Parasites are predators of other organisms, but they're also food. They're also prey for organisms. So once parasites get into their host, they're bathed in food, and so they can divert all their resources to reproduction. So they're pumping out eggs. So there's lots and lots of larval parasites. They're not all going to make it. Most of them don't make it, and they become food for something else. So you're removing a source of biomass from the bottom of the food chain, and that's going to have cascading effects.
Of course, yeah, and I actually didn't really think of it like that at all. You've mentioned like the complexity of their life cycles.
Yep.
And you've mentioned that like if you lose the snails, then you might lose a parasite, the ones that go through the fish. What are some of these life cycles? Because they're requiring very specific hosts by the sounds of it, like to the species.
That's right. Yep. So okay. So you've touched on 2 important aspects of studying parasites. One is the specificity for the host, and the other is their life cycle. Most species of parasites have high specificity for their hosts. Many are restricted to a single species. Most are restricted to either a single species or a group of closely related species. And the rationale or the reasoning behind that's pretty straightforward. Just like with free living organisms, we see some species are broad generalists, things like pigeons that can get into any habitat. But then the majority of species are much rarer and they have very precise niches. They're specialized for a specific habitat. That niche specialization drives diversity. In the same way, we have some parasites that are broad generalists. They can get into all sorts of hosts and cause all sorts of trouble. But we have far more species that are specific for those hosts because that specialization for particular hosts drives diversity. And then the life cycle. So the life cycle is important because it's the way that the parasites overcome all those challenges. They need to get into the host, but then they need to get their eggs or larvae out of the host. And they need to connect one host to the next. They're also important because as traditional parasitologists, one of the main ways that we try to mitigate parasitic disease is interrupt the life cycle. If we can prevent transmission, we can prevent the infection rather than treating a parasite once it's so prevention is better than a cure. So these life cycles can be very complex. They can be simple. There's plenty of parasites that are directly transmitted from one individual of the same species to another individual of the same species. Things like some of these different groups of lice on fish, not true lice, but various crustaceans that reproduce on one fish and just jump from one fish to the next. Those are the ones that cause trouble in aquaculture. things like trematodes have some of the most complex life cycles. So all trematodes, or essentially all trematodes, it's a big group and there's a few exceptions. Essentially all trematodes require at least 2 different host species in their life cycle. One invertebrate host, which is almost always a snail, and one vertebrate host, which can be any vertebrate. Trematodes have managed to get into fishes, amphibians, birds, mammals, reptiles, both marine, freshwater, and terrestrial. But they often require a snail to complete the life cycle. So they require at least one invertebrate, one vertebrate host. Most trematodes have 3 hosts. They have a third intermediate host between those 2 hosts. And for many of them, that's another invertebrate. And it can be, this time, there's many different groups of invertebrates. Crustaceans are very common intermediate hosts, but there's all sorts of groups of invertebrates that can be exploited. Or it could be a vertebrate host. So there's many trematodes that go from a snail to something like a fish or an amphibian, and then into something like a bird or a mammal that feeds on fish. So something like a heron, for example. And part of the success of trematodes, so they're the richest of the parasitic animal groups, is that they use this middle host to move up the food chain. So a snail doesn't come into contact with a heron all that often, but if you add a fish in the middle, the fish is coming into contact with the snail, and then the fish is also coming into contact with the heron. So that's how they manage to exploit all these different species of vertebrates, and that leads to their incredible richness. Adding that many hosts, especially if they're specific for certain species, has a vulnerability. You need to find the right host, and if that host isn't around, the life cycle doesn't get completed. So in order to combat that challenge, the real innovation of trematodes, especially when we compare trematodes to the other parasitic flatworms, things like tapeworms, the real innovation is alternation of sexual and asexual generations. So the sexual adult of trematodes matures in the vertebrate host. So in our example, in a heron. So you get, most trematodes are hermaphroditic, but they still like to cross-fertilize with other individuals if they can. Some of them can self-fertilize if they don't manage to find a host that happens to have other individuals of the same species.
So they just clone themselves?
Well, they fertilize themselves. So they use their own sperm to fertilize their own eggs.
Do they still stay like sexually reproductive?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and some of them might not be able to do this. Some of them can. The frequency with which they're self-fertilizing is going to vary between groups, and for most of the species, we don't know. Mm-hmm. But regardless, whether they're self-fertilizing or cross-fertilizing, inside the intestine of the heron, 2 worms, let's say, meet up, create some eggs, and then they pump those eggs out with the feces of the heron. Those eggs hatch in the water, little larvae come out, and they swim around, they find a snail. It has to be the right species of snail. They penetrate the snail. Obviously, most of those little larvae aren't going to make it. Just per chance, they're not going to come across a snail. But they're going to enter the food chain. They're going to be cleaned up as prey by any number of tiny little things like little copepods in the water column. If they do get into the right snail, if just a single one of those larvae gets into the right snail, it then matures into an adult inside that snail, but it's an asexual adult. And it looks completely different from the sexual form. And they undergo multiple asexual generations within the snail. And this allows a single larvae to release thousands, tens of thousands, in some species, hundreds of thousands of the next larval stage out of the snail. A lot of these snail infections, they have cyclical shedding of the parasites. So once the parasite gets in, it grows, and then it takes over the gonads of the snail and it castrates it. And this is a common strategy for a lot of parasites because for any free living organism, well, for any organism, as soon as they've matured, as soon as they've done everything they need to grow, they then start investing all extra energy into reproduction. So for the parasite, they want that energy to be directed away from reproduction of the snail and towards their own reproduction. So they castrate the host because that's where all that excess energy is being wasted from the perspective of the parasite. So the snail becomes a zombie in the sense that it's no longer contributing to its population. It has zero evolutionary fitness. It's never going to reproduce, but it's still alive and it's crawling around just like a regular snail eating. And then for a lot of these infections, you have cyclical shedding of the next larval stage, which is called a cercaria. So, and this depends on the type of snail. In subtidal snails, it's often a sync to the tide cycle. So at high tide, the snail crawls into the water and all these larvae burst out. And this happens on a 12-hour or a 24-hour schedule. So you have generations of thousands of cercaria coming out, and then they reproduce again inside the snail asexually and do that again in another 24 hours. And over the lifetime of that snail, depending on the species of the snail, the species of the species of trematode, millions or potentially tens of millions of larvae being generated from that single larva that originally got into the snail. So then you have all these larvae coming out of the snail, and they need to find the next host. So let's think.
But they're still asexual.
There's asexual reproduction within the snail, and then the larvae that come out are now a larval stage. So they're going to mature once they get into a heron, into a sexual adult. But first, they need to get into a fish. Now, at this stage, they're probably going to have pretty low specificity because herons eat a bunch of fish. So it doesn't matter what sort of fish they eat.
Are there ones that are very specific?
There are ones that are very specific. Almost all trematodes are highly specific for the snail host. They're highly to moderately specific for their final vertebrate host, so the heron in this case. So for example, in this case, if the worm ended up in a cormorant, maybe it wouldn't mature. But they tend to have more relaxed specificity for that middle host, the fish in this case. Not always. And it depends. In this case, because it makes sense to have low specificity in this case, because herons eat a range of fish, so just get into any fish that you can. So these cercaria that come out of the snail, thousands of them, swimming around, they find a fish if they can, and usually they just penetrate into the muscle, into the tissue, the fins or the muscle, and they form a cyst, and they wait. And they're just waiting and hoping that a heron will eat them. It's no good for them if another predatory fish comes along and eats them, because those parasites are now no longer going to make it to the heron. So there's a lot of luck involved. They have to wait for the heron to eat the infected fish, and then they'll mature into a sexual adult. But you have to remember that there's thousands of these. It's a numbers game. You put thousands of these out, they get into all these fish. Some of those fish are going to get eaten by herons. But okay, so
is it specific to times of years at all? Because I'm not sure about the heron's case, but I'm pretty sure actually they receive around year round. But there's a lot of birds that are migratory.
Yep, absolutely. So more so in temperate areas versus tropical areas, and this is true of free living things as well. In the tropics, you have more stable conditions. So life cycles for free living and parasitic organisms tend to just be perpetual year round without any sort of seasonality. In temperate regions, just like for free living things, we see seasonal cycles for parasites as well. Migratory birds are interesting. Iceland is a particularly interesting example. So geologically, Iceland's fairly new, as in the habitat is fairly new. So it was covered by the last glacial maxima, and there was no habitat left. Essentially, all free-living animals got wiped out because it was covered by a big sheet of ice. When that receded, it opened up a new habitat, a new island, and species progressively colonized it. And of course, some of those species brought their parasites with them. So now Iceland has some snails and it has some freshwater fishes, not an awful lot, but it has some. And it has a bunch of birds. Obviously, a lot of birds can migrate across easily. And it has some predatory birds as well. things like falcons, Gaia falcons, which are resident in Iceland. So they don't migrate across, but a lot of water birds do migrate. And so there's a bunch of parasites in Iceland, and it's interesting to think about how they got there. So for things like trematodes, which require these multiple different hosts in their life cycle, you need all of those pieces in place to support the parasites. But it's only going to be one of those particular hosts that brought them in. And in a lot of the cases, it's going to be the birds. With some frequency, birds actually carry freshwater snails with them when they migrate, either snails that are just attached to them somehow or maybe tangled up on their feet or whatever. Or quite often snails that they consume, but they're protected by their shell and they pass the snail without actually destroying it. The snail survives the passage in the gut of the bird. So this doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough. And if some of those snails have trematodes, potentially that's one of the ways that these parasites got to a place like Iceland. But for however it happened, we now have these parasites in Iceland. And then some of them are parasites that are brought in by migratory birds. And then things like the Gaia falcon preys on these birds and gets the parasite. But for this particular parasite, the snails are there, but so it's a 3-host life cycle, but it can be a facultative 4-host life cycle. So back in mainland Europe, it goes from a snail to an amphibian, a frog, then to a water bird, and it can get into various water birds. And this particular species can
the water birds eating the frogs?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. And then in this particular species, if that water bird, so the final host is a water bird, but if it gets eaten by something like a fox or a Gaia falcon, this parasite can sometimes survive and establish in that next level predator. So it doesn't need a fox or a Gaia falcon as a host, but if there's one around, it can survive the water bird being preyed upon. And that makes sense from the perspective of the parasite. Then it needs to
find the water again.
That's right. So you've got these Gaia falcons that are resident in Iceland. They don't migrate back and forth. So they must have got their infections from the water birds that are migrating back and forth. The reason we know this is because there's no frogs in Iceland, and this parasite needs a frog to complete its life cycle. So you've got the snail, the right type of snail is there, and potentially you could find infections in the snail because those water birds could be transmitting to the snails. But any infections that you see in the water birds in Iceland needed to have come from mainland Europe because there's no frogs to transmit it. And that means that any infections you see in the Gaia falcon must have been worms that originally came from Europe, even though those Gaia falcons aren't from Europe. That's a particularly...
What a journey this little parasite is having.
And it's a dead end because even if that Gaia falcon is releasing eggs into the environment and they get picked up by a snail, there's no frog there to complete the life cycle. These
life cycles are extremely complex. What's the evolutionary advantage, or why did they evolve to do that?
Well, the advantage is so like I said, the complexity has the drawback of a lot of pieces in the chain. If any one of those pieces fail, it's a dead end. But it's overcome by that alternating sexual and asexual reproduction. What that means is that compared to things like tapeworms and things like monogenes, which are the other main groups of parasitic flatworms, by inserting that extra middle host in the life cycle, these trematodes have been able to get into essentially every species of vertebrate on the planet. And that's why they have the greatest numbers. So we have some estimates for how many species we think we have in terms of described species. We don't have an exact number because no one kept a list. There's databases, but it would have made sense if Linnaeus back in the day had kept a list of species. And then we have estimates for how many species we think might be out there. So for the tapeworms, there's one of the main classes of parasitic flatworms. We have somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 recognized described species. And we think as in the best estimates out there are something like 20,000 species. That's decent. Monogenes are ectoparasitic flatworms. So whereas trematodes and tapeworms are internal parasites, monogeneans are external parasites, mostly on fishes, also some amphibians. We have something like 5,800 recognized species, and the best estimates are that there might be something like 25,000 species. And then the trematodes, we've got over 11,000 species. I think something like 11,600 at the moment, recognized species. And the estimates vary, but we think there's at least 50,000 species out there. So they're doing, in terms of richness, number of species, they're doing about twice as good as the tapeworms and the monogeneans. And really, we think the reason for that is that they manage to get into all vertebrates. And they do that because they have that complex life cycle. That complex life cycle connects snails, the first hosts, to vertebrate hosts that are distant from the snails in terms of space within the habitat. You have this intermediate that allows it to move up the food chain.
Right. Why do we see more parasites in like fish in tropical regions than down here?
Well, that's interesting. So generally it's true for all groups, for free living and parasitic groups, that we have greater richness in the tropics. Coral reefs and tropical jungles support greater diversity of species. So that's what we might call a latitudinal gradient of species diversity. As you move towards the tropics, you get increasing diversity. As you move towards the poles, you get decreasing biodiversity. The relationship isn't necessarily true for parasites. There's been several studies that have suggested that there are reverse latitudinal gradients for parasites, that actually parasites have greater species richness and abundance in temperate regions compared to the tropics. But there's problems with that, and I don't fully buy it. Part of the reason is the free-living organisms are much better documented. We know where all these big things are for the large part. For parasites, there's massive historical biases in terms of where all the parasitology has been done. So all around the world, for all groups of parasites, there's still many species to be discovered. But certainly in Europe and in North America, where the first parasite taxonomists and naturalists went out and started documenting parasites, we've got a far better picture of the species. They've done much more. They've made much more progress towards fully documenting the parasite taxa. They had it a bit easier as well. Not only have they had a longer period of time to do it, but because they're in these temperate regions, I suspect that there were fewer species to document in the first place. And of course, much of the tropical world is dominated by developing countries. And these developing countries have huge richness of hosts and therefore huge richness of parasites, but they don't have that long history of parasitologists working on the fauna. In fact, most of the work in these developing countries were European or North American parasitologists traveling to these countries, what's called tropical medicine, and doing the work. A lot of these countries still don't have taxonomic capacity within their countries, local expertise to go out and characterize these faunas. And so when we're talking about latitudinal gradients of diversity, there's far fewer known species in the tropics, partly as an artifact of history. I mean, it could still be the case that there are true reverse latitudinal gradients, but certainly when I go out to a tropical reef, even one that we've been sampling for some time. So my previous group in Queensland has been working on the Great Barrier Reef for something like 30 years, just going out, collecting fishes, different species, dissecting them, looking for worms, and just the trematodes, really. So 30 years, we're still finding more species every time we go back to the same location. We're nowhere near getting on top of all of them. And there's plenty of species of fish that we haven't even looked at yet, the ones that are more difficult to sample, the ones that live a bit deeper or whatever it may be. So I suspect that probably there is greater biodiversity at least in terms of species richness in the tropics. But the reasons are probably just the same as for free living things. There's greater. The main reasons we think that there's greater diversity in the tropics, conventionally for free living organisms, is that the tropics have a more stable climate, and that climate has been more stable over evolutionary time as well. So when we had these ice age events, the impact, of course, was greatest in temperate regions. So there's more stability over time that has allowed for greater evolution of diversity. That leads to all these niche specialization, which drives that biodiversity. In the same way, because you have greater diversity of free living organisms in the tropics, those organisms are habitats for parasites. You would expect that the parasites diversify to match that diversity in hosts.
Are some of these parasites that we find in fish dangerous to humans?
Yes.
Cicatera one?
Well, Cicatera, we can. Yes, if we stretch actually, Cicatera wouldn't quite match the definition for a strict parasite.
Okay.
So the way Cicatera works is it bioaccumulates up the food chain. So it's a toxic single-celled algae, one of a better term. There's more technical terms, but we don't need them. A toxic single-celled algae that moves up the food chain. So as a small fish feeds on smaller crustaceans, every time it eats one of those crustaceans, it's getting the whole life supply of that toxin concentrated into a single meal. When you move up the next trophic step to a bigger fish, you're getting a single dose that represents all of the copepods that smaller fish has eaten. So you're magnifying the amount of toxins as you move up the food chain. And then you get to big fishes. And if we eat one of those big fishes, you're getting a huge dose of toxin all in one meal. And it can be enough to kill people or cause other unpleasant effects. That's not a part of that organism's life cycle. So it's not a parasite in that sense. It's just toxic. There are parasites in fishes that cause trouble if you eat them. For the most part, they're only going to cause trouble if the fish is eaten raw. So most of the parasitic animals in fishes that cause trouble are larval stages that are waiting to get into some sort of fish-eating mammal or bird. And because we're similar enough, they can cause trouble. Sometimes the human is a legitimate host in the sense that parasite establishes it can complete its life cycle in a human. Sometimes it's an accidental dead end. The parasite doesn't want to get into a human. It can't complete its life cycle, but it might end up somewhere where it shouldn't be in the body, and the immune response can be nasty potentially. But for the most part, all of these things are killed if you cook the fish. So by far the greatest prevalence of these sorts of fish-borne zoonotic parasitic diseases are seen in East Asian countries where there's a higher preference for raw fishes. In much of the rest of the world, incidence of these things are very low.
What about here in WA? Is there many or any we should be? Like, I eat a lot of fish.
Do you eat it raw?
I do. Not like only specific species that I usually eat raw. Okay. But I assume like tunas and yellowtail kingfish and those would be a species that would accumulate. Like, I've seen so many different types of parasites in it. Like I cut up in one a tuna last year, and it was full of white dots.
Yeah, okay. Like in the muscle, in the flesh. Yeah. So that will be that will probably be a type of myxozoan, which is an important but historically a rather obscure group of parasites. These are things that for a long time were thought to be single-celled protozoans. They're actually relatives of jellyfishes. They're cnidarians. They're very small.
Right. They're not in the family of cnidarians, are they?
They're in the same phylum as jellyfishes, sea anemones,
Oh,
Yeah, that's right. But they're parasitic. So they're a whole group of cnidarians, the specialist parasites. And their species richness is probably, well, it's certainly dramatically underestimated or underknown. So you can find these things in large variety of fishes, and there's many, many species. The taxonomy is, well, in a way it's very simple, but in a way it's difficult. These things are very simple looking organisms morphologically. There's very little to them. So really you need genetics to appreciate their diversity. But I mean, now we're doing that. And I mean, there's potential for these things potentially to eclipse the species richness of things like trematodes, which I'm not very happy about, but it hasn't happened yet. So those things, those mixozoans, most of the time in natural ecosystems, they're not causing that much trouble for the fish. These are also one of the unusual groups of parasites where the definitive host, so the definitive host in parasitology means the host in which sexual reproduction occurs. So for the trematodes, that's the vertebrates. The asexual reproduction and larval stages are in invertebrates, and then the sexual stages are in vertebrates. It's the other way around for mixozoans. So the tuna in this case is the intermediate host. Effectively, the larval stage is in the tuna, and the final host, the definitive host where sexual reproduction takes place, is probably going to be an oligochaete, so an earthworm. Now it's a tuna, but there are marine oligochaetes, marine earthworms out there. It could also be a polychaete worm, which are much more.
Are they just waiting for the fish to die?
Yeah.
How do they get to that?
So when the fish dies, and this is where these parasites can cause trouble for humans. So when the fish dies, a process called myoliquefaction can start. And that's where the parasite wants to break out. It detects that the host is dying, and so it wants to escape from the host. And so it starts to release enzymes that break down muscle.
So that's why some of the fish that you see, they really turn mushy.
That's right, yeah. And that can be a real problem commercially, because at the time of killing the fish, butchering the fish, the flesh can look fine, but then within someone comes and buys it, and then a few hours later you get home and it's gone to mush.
But usually you would see it, right?
Yeah. So now that people are aware of these things, especially for things like the tuna industry in Japan, there's incredibly high standards, especially when it's going to sashimi or sushi. They're aware of the parasites that cause trouble, and they're looking for them in that processing. So most of these, like parasitic worms, for example, they're big enough to see in the muscle if you're being careful. If you're in some Southeast Asian countries, just mashing up fish whole or eating fish whole, that's where it gets pretty risky. And that's why we have relatively higher prevalence of fish-borne zoonotic diseases there. But in Australia, it's very low. The one that causes, the one that most frequently causes trouble in Australia is probably anisarchid nematodes. So nematodes are roundworms. They're you've got the flatworms and the roundworms. Very easy. Mm-hmm. The roundworms are the other major group. In terms of abundance as a group, number of individuals, not number of species, nematodes are probably the most abundant animals, at least on the planet. There's all these statistics about how many nematodes in a scoop of garden soil, for example. But most species of nematodes, the majority, are free living. But there's multiple lineages, I think at least 18 distinct lineages of nematodes that are parasitic. Most of those are parasites of plants, but plenty of them are parasites of animals, including fishes. One of the most common groups we see in fishes are the anisarchids, and these use fishes usually as a larval stage, and they're waiting to get into a marine mammal, something like a dolphin, sometimes a seabird, and of course we're a mammal. So we're close enough to a dolphin that if one of these larval nematodes gets into us, it can wriggle around and cause some trouble. It won't complete its life cycle, but it won't be killed immediately by the digestive juices.
Would a human die or just get really
very
sick?
rarely? I think there are a few suspected cases, but it's pretty rare. Usually it's misdiagnosed as food poisoning, or we think the frequency of anasarchidosis, the disease caused by anasarchid larvae in Australia, has been historically underdiagnosed as food poisoning.
Right. So when people go, I'm going to talk about personal experience actually. Like I was overseas.
Yeah.
I was on an island in Indonesia, and I thought, I was like, oh, this island's like really quite good. I ate some raw seafood, some sushi and all that. I got so sick. Right. I just put it down that like maybe it went off or whatever, but it potentially could have been.
Again, we always have to be careful not to get too excited about parasites.
Yeah.
But certainly it could have been any number of parasites. The fact that you got sick and recovered probably means it wasn't a parasite that establishes in you and is still there causing trouble.
Yeah.
You probably know about it if it was.
Yeah.
So
but it was enough to get me sick.
Yeah. And really that's the host immune system destroying the parasite that causes all the trouble that you experience. It could have been a parasite, could have been something like bacteria from, if the fish is left sitting out for, if it's not refrigerated.
Yeah, well, that was that's what I thought it was, because I was walking down the street earlier that day and saw a wahoo getting transported on a moped where the guy was just like had it across his feet. Right, okay, right. And then I was like, some stupid reason to me, I was like, I'll go get some sushi. It's like, but anyway.
Well, the wahoo worm, which is one of the biggest trematodes. This thing's massive. You can sit in the palm of your hand. It's maybe 6 or so centimeters long. It's a big old worm. That wouldn't make you sick. You could probably actually eat it as a small meal. It's big old.
Well, that's the biggest trematode, or
one of the biggest trematodes. Yeah,
because the nematodes, they can get like the tapeworms, they get like 24 meters or something.
Yeah, tapeworms can get massive. So human tapeworms can get around 20 meters.
Yeah.
Usually as in a typical big one gets about 7 or 8 meters in the human gut.
Yeah. So I kind of just plucked that number from nowhere. I don't know. No, I got 24
you're right. There are some species that have been reported to get up to about 20 meters in humans. That's usually you wouldn't leave a tapeworm in there long enough for it to grow that big. Yeah, tapeworms are pretty wild.
I see these type of nematodes in fish, particularly these. It was in one particular estuary inside the hardyheads that they would be. The side, like you just see the guts, hardyhead. Oh yeah, hardyhead's like the atheronid. And you could tell exactly that nearly every one of these fish had nematodes in it, but particularly certain ones, their belly was just massive, huge. And then I'd cut it open, pull it out, and some of them had like 10, 12 nematodes in there that were like almost double the length of the fish itself.
Right, okay. And are they inside the gut or in the body cavity on the outside of the gut?
I wasn't very fine. I would just rip it open, and it's small fish, and it's just ripping open, going like, look, because it was just blowing my mind. Like they were all there, like to the extent like some of these fish were bursting, like they just would have eventually burst and died, and like the size of them, like so this fish is like maybe 4 or 5 centimeters long, and these parasites are now 6, 7 meters long, like bigger than what they were living inside, just curled up. And
so those will probably be larval nematodes, and by accumulating in that way, they're going to be having an impact at that stage on the fitness of the host, and therefore the likelihood that it gets eaten by the right type of definitive host. So depending on the group of nematodes, it could be a predatory fish. Good chance for atherinids, hardyheads, that it's a bird.
Well, this particular actually had a really low diversity.
Right. Okay.
So across the 2 types of sampling we were doing, which is like seine netting, which catches all your small fish, and then gill netting, I think it was like total of maybe like 4 species of fish or 6 species of fish across both types, which is really, really low for an estuary.
Even more likely that it's a bird in that case.
And like the prevalence of this nematode was like in every hardyhead.
It could also be that there's a bit of a concentration effect if there's so few species of fish around. How big is this estuary? Is it relatively small?
Yes, very small.
Well, so it could be that you've got the right sort of intermediate invertebrate host there. These nematodes are coming out, and the athorinids are there in numbers, and so they're just.
There was lots of snails in there.
Well, I mean,
which was like really surprising. Yeah. Like this estuary was almost like a freshwater lake,
right?
Because it was really low salinity, and we're seeing all these like freshwater plants, freshwater invertebrates, and one of them being like snails. I remember that observation. I'm like, there's just so many of this type of snail that I never see in any other.
Good chance that snail has something to do with it. I suspect.
Yeah. It's all drawing it together. It's pretty cool.
So it's interesting in that. Okay, there's two things going on there that are interesting. One is as those worms accumulate, it's impacting the fitness of the host so that predation becomes more likely. That's in the interest of the parasite if those worms are larval. If they're adult worms, that's not a good thing. You want the fish to be eaten if you're the adult worm. You want that fish to live as long as it can so that you can keep pumping out eggs. So if they were adults, and they're probably not just on the basis of probability. If they were adults, it might be that this estuary is so small that there's too much overcrowding of these nematodes, such that they're getting picked off by birds. Like the nematodes are hurting themselves by having too many in the host, and that could lead to, if we're thinking in evolutionary terms, that could lead to the nematodes controlling their numbers. So, for example, there's trematodes in humans, blood flukes. These unusual trematodes, and then instead of living in the gut, they live in the circulatory system, and they're a big problem. They kill people, but it's not in their interest to kill the host because they need to be pumping out eggs. These are one of the trematodes that receive the most attention in terms of research because they're important. But what we now know is that and also these blood flukes in humans are also unusual because they're not hermaphrodites. They're separate male and female. So they need two to find each other in the human host. Once they get into a host and they pair up, we now know that they diminish the chance of subsequent infections of more blood flukes, because if you ended up with too many of these worms in the host, you'd kill the host. So they actively suppress. I believe they upregulate parts of the immune system that specifically would attack larval worms as they're entering the host. So they keep the host to themselves.
What are the chances I would have one?
A blood fluke?
Low.
Pretty low.
What about other parts of parasites? I definitely have parasites. So everyone has parasites, right?
If we stretch it to things like bacteria, almost certainly. Otherwise, most people are coming into contact with some parasites at some point in their life. Things like these eyelid mites, for example. I mean, there's a good chance we both have them and we'd never know about it. They're not causing any trouble. This also gets to the social importance of parasites, because serious parasitic disease today is very much a burden on the developing world compared to the developed world. Part of that is geographical. Things like bacteria and viruses are the main problems that we were dealing with in places like Europe and North America back in the colonial period, whereas the burden from things like worms was far greater and more varied in the colonies at that time. Places in the New World, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia. And that's part of the historical divide between microbiology and tropical medicine, which is the study of parasites. It was colonial powers studying these parasites really because they were impacting productivity in the colonies. You had all these people that were supposed to be working, or maybe they were slaves in growing various crops, and they're being afflicted by all these parasites. It's no good for production. It's unlikely, well, most of us in the developed world don't come into contact with serious parasites that cause serious, in terms of parasitic animals, things like worms, we don't usually come into contact them within our lifetime.
Okay.
They're still a big problem in a lot of tropical places. So for that blood fluke in particular, if you were walking around some rice paddies on your way down to eat that tasty wahoo, there's a chance that you could have picked some of them up, but it's unlikely. You would have known about it.
Yeah, it's kind of like listening and learning about how vast they are and diverse. Yeah. It's like kind of like it's obvious that I've got like that we've all got parasites of some sort on us.
Yep.
But yeah, whether they're dangerous or not, like especially
I mean, most of the time, no.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd know if they were causing trouble.
Yeah. I get sent so many pictures of fish with parasites and they ask me what it is. And then usually I forward it on to you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, fish really are good hosts. They're loaded with all sorts of things.
Yeah, so many different types. Like I'm constantly, I remember when you were in the lab with us when I was processing fish and giving you and you're pointing them all out. Like I just never even bothered to look apart from these obvious ones with the guts. But you're like pointing them out that they're on the tails and all that. You're like, oh, I didn't even see them.
Yeah, once you start seeing them and then the next step is once you realize you get that feel for the different groups and you understand that a lot of these species of fish haven't been looked at or haven't been looked at in places like here. So therefore a lot of these parasites are new species, undiscovered, undescribed. When you look at a fish out there, it just becomes a bag of potential discoveries. Like there's so many species of parasites.
I've had some recently sent to me of like this big black parasite and they've like popped inside the belly of I think it was like snapper and jewfish or something.
Yeah. Okay.
And they popped it and it was like squid ink.
Yeah. So that's what
I've never seen them
commonly called inkworm. But it's actually if it is what I think it is, it's actually a crustacean. And it's a crustacean, probably a parasitic copepod. Most parasitic copepods look at least vaguely reminiscent of free-living copepods, and they
look like a slate. I don't know how you'd describe it.
Yeah, like a little water, kind of like the equivalent of an insect in the marine environment. And so there's just like the nematodes. There's many free-living copepods. They're a big component of the plankton community, very important in food chains. There's also many groups of parasitic ones. And among the arthropods, at least in the marine environment, copepods are the dominant group of parasitic crustaceans and arthropods. Most of them are just living on the outside of the fish, but there's a few special ones like this inkworm that burrows into the flesh. So they're an external parasite that then becomes kind of an internal parasite. They burrow through the flesh.
In terms of eating them, we should just cut it out.
They're not going to cause any trouble.
And then eating the rest of the fish. Yeah. Is that like majority of parasites apart from the ones that break down the flesh?
Yeah. So in the case like that, if that copepod ended up in you, your digestive system's just going to destroy it. You're the wrong host. It's not going to cause any trouble.
That's good to know.
They're unsightly. You probably wouldn't eat it. But I know a colleague who pan-fried one of these tongue-biting isopods in a little butter and garlic.
Oh my God.
And
it's crunchy. It's like a bug.
It's like a prawn.
Yeah.
But smaller and more obscure.
I think it's just like knowing the word parasite, going back to that negative connotation and then eating it just sounds so wrong. But it would be just like a.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. We never thought of it. Yeah. I guess it's just looking at it a different way.
Yeah.
Because like some of those isopods. Well, isopods.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like they're huge. They're like the size. Well, the deep sea ones. They're like the size of a little dog.
Yeah. Those deep sea ones are free living, but the parasitic ones are big relative to most parasites in fishes, and they're external or inside the mouth. They're attached in a way that you can see them pretty easily. There's all these photos that scuba divers take of these things attached to fish. Actually, I think it was in 2017, the underwater photographer of the year, the winning photo, or at least for one of the categories, was this photo of 3 clownfish in an anemone, and they've all got their mouths open, and each of them has one of these little tongue biter isopods sitting in its mouth, poking out.
I haven't seen that one.
It's a nice photo.
Yeah. I saw so many in the yellowtail scads
Yes.
off Perth.
Yep. So around here, the scad gets them with really high prevalence.
It was like I reckon 80%.
Yeah. That's my experience as well. Garfish around here get the big garfish from.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I bought some from the fish market. They all had them.
Yeah. Right.
So, your experience is probably that most species of fish and most individuals, you don't see them. So these isopods are one of the groups of parasites that get a relatively decent attention because they're easy to see and they're big and people know about them. But they're not a super rich group. There's something like 380 described species compared to thousands for these trematodes. They do still have high specificity for their host, so that one from the yellowtail scad's probably specific to the scad, and it's probably specific to the tongue. So some of them replace the tongue, some sit on the gills or somewhere else in the mouth. A few of them burrow into the flesh. You might have seen the ones in the leather jackets around here. Pretty impressive and quite big.
Yeah, they've created a little hole den.
That's right. So they
looks like it hurts.
It has to.
Kind of almost like a blackhead or a pimple that you just want to pop. And get out.
So leather jackets are. We have quite a good diversity of leather jackets in southern Australian waters, but you also get species in the tropics. We have one of these isopods here. It's called Urasuctes, and it's
what a name.
It's a great name. It attaches to the side of the leather jacket, and it burrows in towards the body cavity. The host response grows a very thin epithelial membrane around it to protect the internal organs. But these things are basically sitting on the internal organs inside the body cavity. This is the female. And this is one of the biggest of these isopods. These things comfortably get to around 5 centimeters, maybe a little bigger. And their back end, so they make this little hole, this burrow in the flesh of the fish. Leather jacket skin is like a
I was going to say they could have chose any other fish that's a lot easier to penetrate, but leather jacket skin it's like made up of little teeth. It's like tentacle.
That's right.
Denticle structures, and it's like really thick. And if you look under a microscope, it's literally pointy teeth.
Yeah, so it's difficult to get through, but once you're in, the skin's loose. Like the loose and baggy in the body cavity is fairly large, really. So there's because they get quite large, once they burrow in, they can distend the body, this loose bag of leathery skin around them. But they need to keep a little hole at the back because these isopods still need to ventilate their own gills, just like other crustaceans with seawater. So seawater's coming in through this hole and they're ventilating it with their little legs, just like a prawn or something. And the female will sit there. They have all of these parasitic isopods have a marsupium. So the Peninsula larva develops in the marsupium. These big ones can get hundreds of these things. They need a male to crawl in there to mate with. The male's much smaller than the female, but then all these little babies are coming out. And so these ones in the mouth are the same. They have a big marsupium. So there's a species in Moreton Bay off Brisbane of this isopod that gets on a species of Selena toca, which is a scatophagus, one of these dirty sort of fish that lives in Moreton Bay. And we get really high prevalence. It's something like 97% prevalence there. So similar to the yellowtail scad. And there was a study, maybe early 2000s, looked at the impact on the fish and how big the parasite was relative to the fish. So they found that this thing regularly takes up about 80% of the buccal cavity, so the space in the mouth. It sits, I can't remember if it sits on the tongue or on the gills, but it takes up most of the available space in the mouth. And 97% prevalence. But when you look at body condition, there's no detectable difference between infected and uninfected individuals. So these are big, obvious parasites. That one in the leather jacket, I reckon, has to be causing some trouble. But a lot of these ones sitting in the mouth, even though they're obvious, they don't seem to be causing that much damage to the fish. Yeah.
Why are they?
in this case, it's not in their interest to cause too much damage. Once they're there, they're just sitting there feeding, reproducing. They just want the fish to live its life.
Is the fish also eating its babies? Because like
I don't know. Like
in the mouth.
Yeah, some of them must be.
I see like the scat one because I've pulled quite a few of the parasites off to look at them, and you just see there underneath their belly.
Yeah, the
area.
big pouch. Yeah,
yeah, it's just full of babies, and it's kind of like gross looking. To be honest,
well, it can't be nice having those things scurrying around in your mouth.
No.
I imagine.
And
some
then
of
they
them,
release them. They have to be like it's releasing in the mouth of a fish.
Yeah, that's right. So I think they mostly just escape across the gills through the gill, the operculum, just with the water passing through. I guess some of them must get lost, trapped in the gills, get eaten accidentally.
Who knows?
Intentionally, maybe.
Yeah.
So some of these, the ones that attach on the tongue, they grab onto the tongue with their legs, and the tongue atrophies away. It withers away because there's no more blood supply, and it just becomes a little stump. And then the parasite replaces the tongue, and the fish uses it like a tongue. And if you look at the dorsal side of these isopods, because they have these ridges, you can see how the texture of them is sufficient that the fish can still like grasp prey, for example, using this parasite in place of its tongue, which is
wild.
Yeah.
Crazy. Yeah.
Wild.
Yeah.
Yep.
I can't imagine the fish notices too much because I don't know.
It's tough with fish to get a sense of how much they experience pain.
Yeah. Well, that's like everyone when they talk
to,
about fishing or everything like that. So it's
they're not an animal that, I mean, they show distress when they're panicked or injured, but they seem to recover. Yeah, that's right. Once they get past that initial, it's hard to know, hard to empathize with how much pain and suffering they're feeling. Yep.
If you had unlimited time and money, what would be your dream project?
Well, certainly take the unlimited time. I like to think that most of my research can be done on a pretty modest budget. We're just going out, catching fish, looking for worms. Time is a real problem. And I think that's probably true for any taxonomist. For parasites, there's just so many species out there. I've got something like 100 species that I think are new species sitting in my office, in my lab, waiting to be worked on. My dream research really is not necessarily comprehensively completing some of these groups, but getting to a point where we have a good understanding of some of these groups in terms of their diversity and their richness. Then the other part of my research looks at the biogeographical distribution of parasites, which is pretty poorly understood. We have a hard time determining whether species found in one part of the world are the same as in another part. Parasites often have quite simple morphology, and so two species can look similar. The molecular age, genetics, has really only got it started in the last couple of decades for parasites. So we're still catching up and trying to look at distribution. So I like to sample in nice places around the world and I like to compare the parasites in the fish. Yeah. So nothing too crazy.
Yeah.
Although there is, I will say, there is a trematode from the platypus. Actually, there's 3 trematodes in the platypus. There's one in particular that's quite special. I don't think I think it was described in something like 1905 or 1915. It hasn't really been seen since. Back then, they just went out and shot a few platypi. Obviously, you can't do that anymore.
No.
But one of these trematodes has its own family. So it's just like the platypus when it was discovered was this crazy, unique animal, different to everything else. It has its own worm that is equally bizarre. It's an entirely unique trematode. It looks really different to all other things. Its body is essentially sideways. We know the broader group that we think it belongs to. It'll be really interesting to get some genetic sequences for that and place it in the family tree. That's one of my dream projects. I don't want to go shoot a platypus.
Yeah. What would be like one of the life cycles for that? Would the next level bit from like, how does a platypus, is it like just putting out its eggs into free living, or does something else need to eat the platypus?
So for that particular worm, we don't know the specific details of the life cycle, but almost certainly it's a 3-host life cycle. It starts in a snail, or the eggs come out of the platypus. either hatch into larvae.
How do they come out? Through their poop?
Yeah. So this is a gut worm. Most trematodes just live in the gut. Come out through the poop. Larvae infects a snail, or maybe the snail eats the eggs.
Could you not then just collect the platypus's poop?
You'd get the eggs and you could sequence it. So something like eDNA, we could potentially also sample it now through the poop, potentially through the snail. This is assuming the trematode is still an extant species. Platypus obviously are threatened in various places. Parasites are lost before the host. So originally this worm would have been collected in a particular creek or whatever. We could maybe go back to that creek if it's still there. I don't know if all platypus in all parts of Australia have them. We don't know. Even if we went and looked at that particular creek, maybe there's 10 different species of snail. Who knows which one's the right species? Trematodes often have very low prevalence in the snail. So it could be 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 snails are infected if the parasite's still around. So there's a few ways we could go about attempting to collect it other than shooting a platypus or waiting for one to die. But it'd be very interesting to get a sequence of one of these things.
What about, do you have a least favorite parasite?
Okay. All right. I frequently get asked by students what my favorite parasite is. And
let's go the opposite.
Well, I was going to say I don't often give a very satisfactory answer. Different favorites for different reasons. There's two parasites I don't like to see when I'm cutting open a fish. One is a particular group of nematodes called the cuculanids. These are fairly short nematodes. They're pretty common in fish. And they've got big old jaws on the front. They're parasites, but we're pretty sure they're also chomping on the trematodes in the gut. And that's no good for us.
Yeah.
And certainly if you isolate these in a little dish with the worms, so we work on fresh fish, so the worms we're finding are alive. If you leave them in there too long, they'll take chunks out of your samples. It's no good. So I don't like to see those. The other group I don't like to see are the larval stages of tapeworms. Tapeworms are incredibly beautiful, exciting looking things as adults. Some of them are quite beautiful as larval stages, but in the marine world, they're predominantly going to sharks and rays. And sharks and rays eat fishes pretty indiscriminately. And so the larval stages have really low specificity. They get into just any fish. We see them all the time. It's often the case that I'm cutting open an exciting fish, no trematodes, and it's just full of these little larval tapeworms. And I throw them down the sink.
You throw them away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's too many of them.
That's good reasons why not to like them.
Yeah. There's some worms you shouldn't collect. Larval tapeworms, I think, are one of them.
Yeah. Storm, this has been great. It's really opened my eyes to right from the very first thing you told me about that ticks and those aren't parasites. I would completely. I had a line of actually tick questions.
They're not off limits for discussion.
No, I'm sure you're quite aware of them. But yeah, so it's been extremely fascinating. We've covered a huge, broad topic, and hence why this has been it's actually talked for a long time.
Right.
And it's flown by. I did not realize how long we were going for.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Had a great time. This has been great. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. No worries. Thank you.